Hi, my name's Eli Howey. I'm a multidisciplinary artist. I started out in printmaking, art books, DIY culture, zines kind of space, and I've over the years branched into watercolor and gouache painting, sculpture with paper and ceramics to kind of build out into installation, and more recently into interview-based projects that are a collaboration between interview and artists, so visualizing the content from like the creative space of the imaginative space of other people's brains. And most recently I've been doing some animations and music and bringing that all together in a project called Little Window. What I liked best about art books was that it was defined with so much space to stretch what their final project could look like. So it's just any form of content, like artistic content and concept, in between kind of 2 pages. But even with my instructors and stuff, they were like, that could be audio content, that could be like photography content, that could be hand-drawn. There's no strict rules on how you output it, and you can be as creative as you want to inside of that container. So like in that sense, yeah, like you have a container and you can do anything inside of it. It's about making multiples and putting it out into the world. So I really liked that you could make many things and share them with many people, and that could be more of an intimate exchange, especially with books and different forms of visual content, where normally your visuals are going to be like in a gallery setting, just out in the open. Books were like just you and the reader kind of face to face, and that exchange was more meaningful and more private and more vulnerable in some sort of way. So when I was at fairs and tabling, I got to have a lot of more intimate conversation, intimate exchange about the topics that I presented in the work, and also just like get to know people in a different way and just start facilitating like a deeper conversation. I studied printmaking at OCAD University. I switched into it from painting, drawing and painting. I really liked that it was a medium with like multiple access points to like sharing your work and getting your work out there. I was feeling like really like I was painting and I was filling my house up with paintings, and I really wanted to like just have the work be in public space like immediately, like no waiting, so, and facilitate that myself. So with printmaking and DIY culture, I had access to that right away. So it's like this concept of art books, and that freedom and that space and that like stretchiness that shaped what I would consider like the framework for how I would approach more mediums, and like why I felt like it was okay to continue to do so. And printmaking in general is like very foundational in that as well, because my philosophy with printmaking was always that I'm kind of like a jack of all trades, but I'm a master of print. I know how that comes along with being a printmaker and being into DIY is that, yeah, that creativity in every step. Like I loved to be able to choose everything from the color of like the binding thread to like the paper, what texture, what colors to use throughout the project. How can that carry over? Because, you know, it's the same ink, so I can be printing that onto the t-shirts, the clothing, the prints, and then this creates this cohesive kind of, I wouldn't call it necessarily, what is it, your own unique style or whatever. It also, as a process, built my relationship to color, built my relationship to making. So as I loved marbling inks in the books, so I'm printing an edition of 100, there's 25 pages. So as you're marbling the inks, as you go through to print that entire edition, you're accumulating these like mixtures of like, say like the bright red and the bright blue as they mix together. And I'm accumulating neutral palettes that are built from the colors, the highly saturated colors in the book, and then I'm starting to use them and put them together, and obviously they work within the color schemes because they're like the mixtures, or like yeah, just built from like the natural process, or like seeing the colors layered over each other just on the edges, or to make the tertiary colors, because obviously with print, you know, you have your two colors but you're overlapping two colors, makes your third color, or depending if you did like a halftone overlapping, you're getting these other colors show up that are in that relationship to the other thing. So yeah, print and books together really built my understanding of color, and my relationship to like when to add another color, because you're also starting with limited palettes if you want to like lessen your workload. So you learn to do a 2-color print successfully, you learn to do a 3-color print successfully, and you kind of build that skill set of like adding what to add, when to add it, when not to, when does it take it away. With like failed prints, you're like, this looked good up until this point, and then I added this 3rd color, and then it kind of threw off the balance. Why did it throw that off? What were the percentages? So print has been like so important. So when I got injured, I was doing my residency at Open Studio doing large scale etching. So I was doing an 11 plate etching, and I was also working at Repetitive Press with Jesse Purcell doing work for him. And I was printing clothing at my studio, Punch Clock, in Toronto, on Sororan. And all 3 of those, I just overexerted myself. So I essentially couldn't print anymore for a certain amount of time. I didn't know how long that would be. It was how I accessed many revenue streams, like just with like more commercial art with clothing, my personal practice with comics and art books, and then yeah, just subcontracting, and then the more fine art practice with the etching, which was more like of a gallery space setting rather than like, you know, a zine-fair or a commercialized practice. So like a storefront, building relationships with storefronts and having my clothing and stuff sold there. So it kind of cut me from all of my revenue streams that I had built to that point. So I had to come up with a new strategy, and I think would be incredibly daunting if I didn't have this relationship to like concept and practice in these 2 containers, and the flexibility inside of like print and art books, that I was like, okay, how do I just need to find a new way to like carry out the message and the style, and so like what's the new format that will work. And I started with painting. I think this was in 2017 or 2018, not entirely sure. So I was offered by 2D Cloud to do a publication that would be published, my first international publication, so a full-length graphic novel. And I had applied to do my first solo show outside of printmaking, and I pitched a painting series. And so for both, what I saw as like the most accessible thing to carry out, like to continue my practice and attempts to like restructure it with my new range of ability, was to start with painting. So the publication allowed for me to have this like very strict regimented, I don't even know, it felt like boot camp almost. So I wanted to do a hand painted comic book, and it's 100 pages, 110 pages to kind of make it substantial enough in like a full narrative, which I'd never done. I'd still stuck kind of like into like 25, 50 page, more art comic space, abstract narrative. So I wanted to do my first narrative, tell a full story. And then with that, I wasn't really sure about approaching painting. I hadn't painted. I'd only done layer separation, analog layer separation, so like acetate ink to make my books. So I haven't actually made a painting like pen to paper, brush to paper, or whatever, in like years at that point. So yeah, this was what I mean by like the boot camp. I just sketched out all of the pages in order, kind of in a panic, because I was just like, I need to figure out how to keep my practice going. And I bought pens, watercolor, paints, brushes, like sponges for stamping, just like anything I could think of to start doing like the direct mark making to color the comic. And just, yeah, started with page 1 and went all the way to page 110. It was based on the deadline. It was just like I had to paint about 4 to 8 hours every single day until the deadline, or else it's not going to get finished. So yeah, it's just like very, very strict regimented framework. And then this also, so this like graphic novel created the container for transitioning my practice into a new space, because it was entirely out of necessity, but also yeah, just having to push through. And then as I went through and painted every single page, like I started to build a relationship to painting that would go on to inform like a style at the end of it. You can kind of see it if you read through Fluorescent Mud is the book. It's just like I'm getting used to it. I'm trying out different color schemes. There's like some fussiness with the medium, and that's what really created what my painting practice is built around. So this like needing to fix stuff in a way that watercolor doesn't allow, so then that's where the opaque gouache comes in, and I start fixing things and realizing that they kind of have the different textures can create they're useful for different things. So like the gouache for different objects, the watercolor for different objects, so like watercolor, and like that texturing for like rocks and like ground cover, or when do I need to like do an opaque fill. And I really approached it as a printmaker, so in layers. Like gouache and watercolor don't go together very well. They like obviously if you watercolor, with the watercolor I was using, it's always like re-wettable, and then you can just make a mess of it. If you're trying to do like some watercolor washes next to a pile of gouache, it's just gonna bleed everywhere. So I really took a printmaker approach of being like, lay down this texture, this texture, this texture, which watercolor lends itself to, because of the transparency of the layers creates like the most beautiful textures and colors, and then layering in the gouaches to the completion of the page. So I created, yeah, there's like a unique, I guess what I'm trying to say is that like art books and comics and printmaking informed this way of painting, and that boot camp project really jump-started me learning and getting to a comfortable point with painting. And so immediately after I finished Fluorescent Mud, I started to paint some large-scale paintings for an exhibition. This exhibition, Passageways, was to be shown at Margin of Errors Gallery in Toronto. It was my first opportunity to do like a solo show as a painter. I wanted to do that in more of like a kind of a traditional way for some reason, and I wanted to present the work like framed, work large scale, have the paintings be like the focus, which in my previous exhibitions it was kind of more of a range, something that felt like it was building out from like my zine-fair space in that kind of exhibition strategy. So with this, I painted probably about 20 to 25 paintings. The concept was just around translating non-visual space to visual space and creating different visual metaphors for making that clear. So things like intuition and like senses and sensation, or like the different influences impacting somebody from a non-visual space, and then trying to yeah, it's create a visual language to symbolize those concepts, to make them more understandable, shareable, relatable, and just always coming back to my specific experience with gender and exploring identity through that lens rather than the other direction, which I think is how people hit identity. Like, we talk about identity a lot as like in our visual codes and signifiers, and like how we understand things like gender and experience and all of the assumptions that come along with that from the outside in. So yeah, just passageways was the point, to be the other direction, and those things coming through from the inside, or that sort of like inverting that approach, and just really trying to make it as clearly communicated as possible. It's fairly abstract still, and like most people were reading things sometimes exactly how I wanted them to be read, or how I was intending them to be read, but other times having completely different relationships to those visual symbols, which was almost the most amazing part of that process. But just to see like how unique everybody's imaginative space is to their framework of experiences. So yeah, just as a process, like conceptually, that was really great. But what I found with the gallery exhibition, as it felt like it was lacking a certain type of intimacy I was used to being able to achieve with books. Again, what I was saying before about that like direct, like person to person space that art books allowed. So like you speaking kind of like one-on-one with the person reading it, like you and the getting that intimate kind of exchange that facilitates those deeper conversations. Like I was still able to do that, but in the exhibition setting I was like, how do I make that more of an immersive setting? So how can I like recreate, so the gallery as the art book container, so that framework, what do I do in that container to make it more intimate, to make it more like vulnerable, to make it more like a whole environment experience, like one-on-one. So I saw that as an opportunity to implement installation inside of the space. I really saw sculpture as a way to build out the visual metaphors in the work into real space, so that they could be experienced in a new way, like a different sensory experience of the metaphor. And these installations in a gallery setting would provide provide like a unique opportunity to like take up space and have you kind of be inside of the paintings. But to bring this back around to the topic of that how art books and comics kind of facilitated all of these developments in the practice, is also in the lifestyle. So as like an artist, to socialize your work, to like mobilize it, I did touring for the comic books, just traveling for I think about 2 months. Internationally, it was like across Canada, then back across the States, and then I went over and did some overseas fairs. And this like constant movement, I had to create like a practice that was more mobile for that time period. And then in between all of that, there were like residencies, short-term living situations in places closer to the residencies. So I'd been living out of a suitcase probably for a year at that time. And to make sure I could still practice, I had to adapt things to be like a backpack practice. So what that meant was I started doing experiments with bringing together plant forms that I was like seeing in every city. So different ecology, different place, and then combining them with a different animal drawing of some sort, and sometimes figures. So just like a plants and figures, I guess, more general way of explaining it, and bringing these two things together. And yeah, the inspiration is direct, just like wandering around each city that I went to, or like time spent in transit, like walking to and from venues or whatever I needed to do. And either just like snapping a picture of a little plant, or like taking the time to do a doodle of a little plant, or taking that in and trying to memorize it, which is a big part of my practice. This like memorization for later when you're stuck in one spot in transit, or just like in between things, like at a fair when you're behind the table and you have to stay there all day, but like to stay busy. So like memorizing forms and then translating them into different line qualities, and then translating the line qualities that come out of those observations of plants, and then adapting it into like the line quality of the figures. So there's a relationship between the energy of the line work and the form of the plant, and then the energy in the line work and the form of the figure. This was like a great experiment for my brain, just in like adapting my more, I wouldn't say it was realistic, but like I have like more of like a drafting type of brain when it comes to like drawing spaces and environments. So it disrupted that, and I really enjoyed that process. Just to make the touring, which could be kind of monotonous and have a lot of downtime, into its own experimental container for making work. And then the other thing I was doing at that time, which this has been like a long-term practice through traveling and different things. I did multi-track recording of music. It was just like a side project. I gave up on it a long time ago as like more serious practice, to focus on artwork. But while traveling, because like I would bring an instrument with me, I'd bring around a tape player, and I'd record little snippets of like songwriting on tape, that just like fit into a moment. It would just be like a phrase, so I could continue that practice while being on tour, or being traveling to residencies, not being able to like drag all this gear with me to record music. It facilitated like a very interesting music practice about instantaneous songwriting, and like capturing that moment of translation, and really focusing on that skill of like moving that song through your body without interruption, and like kind of without ego disruption, of it just like happening and being for myself, and just like that moment and capturing that moment. It's the music was never intended to be meant for anything. It was for myself, just so I can keep cataloging different songs and stuff. But yeah, through that process, it shifted into like capturing this moment, and like how to notice and anticipate it happening, how to not disrupt or augment it by like thinking about like it in an ego-based way, like, will people like this? Is this marketable? What genre is this? Or anything else that's like actually just ridiculous to think about, and then capture just in an authentic form. And then it's just kind of like incredibly vulnerable, as most musicians I think would say, when it comes to like songwriting and singing and all of those things. But it was very like healthy for me just to like start that movement of things, of like, you're taking things from, again, like I talked about with the passageways practice, from a non-visual space out into a tangible space through music. So it seems unrelated, but it is actually like the same, I don't know what the word would be, like the same overall concept for creation, of like taking things from non-visual space and externalizing them through your body being that passageway that can manifest these like non-tangible pieces of information or feeling or anything like that, or experience. So it's like this identity production. So this stacking of those things is like, I learned this through my experience with gender transition, putting things from your identity space, wearing them on your body and slowly externalizing them, seeing what they feel like and understanding them and making meaning from them. So is the artwork, trying to do that with the artwork. And that's kind of what art is, I guess, in a more of a sweeping statement, but like pulling things through, making them real in a way that's shareable, like containers of information. And then same with the music. So that's what the music practice also was. And then that became, I guess maybe because I was in an art-focused setting with touring, with residencies, that the music kind of started to be framed inside of that same experience. The current version of that project is working with insight from the trans community on how to move through a major life transition. It is one of the most vulnerable states we can be in as humans, and it's when we probably need the most support and guidance. And a lot of people who are not in the trans community, I feel like, don't have to ask themselves the types of questions that trans people have to ask themselves to move through this process, and face identity crisis that some people could just avoid or will just be in the backdrop. And one of the major things that I found out in these, in considering like what questions to ask and what is life transition in all of its different forms, is that it's going to be more consistent that you are in transition than you are in a pause state. So when I went through my life experiences to see what were the major life transitions that I can use to model questions to interview my community with, I had a harder time finding times in which I wasn't in one. At this time, I'm still working on that portion of the project for interviewing people for insight about major life transitions. So if you're a trans person and you have insight you want to share, feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm always interested in hearing from people. Even if you just want more information about the project, just contact. Right now with my practice, I'm trying to bring together more separate components into like one meeting place. So I saw hand-drawn animation as a way to do that. I always wanted to do animation, and my background in comics and making storyboards and stuff like that, I always visualized the information in movement, and comic books seemed like the most accessible way to do that, and to create that, to complete that vision. And a lot of the paintings in themselves were like staged and in motion. They're like scenes, which is why I wanted to build them out into installations as well. So with animation, I could finally bring all of that together, and it allowed for me to bring in the final component that has always been separate, which is music. This foundation I was talking about with print and art books, and the art book container and the experimental information, like, I think it's really obvious that like that's where I built out from, and that's why it really allowed me to feel confident about taking those risks and creating my own formats. As long as I start from this this foundation, then all of those other things seem possible and seem viable for under one practice, as long as you're carrying through one, I don't want to say just an aesthetic, but my conceptual framework being that, like, pulling non-visual space through. I love that flexibility. I like to work on across a large range of mediums. It's also so important for me with my injuries, just that like I'm using I'm producing art in a diverse range of movements, just on a daily basis, not just sitting, not just standing, not just printing especially. In the past, with my work in the art book and zine and comics community, I had made audio projects before. I hand printed CDs and things of my music experiments, but with Little Window as a project that brings together animation and art and music, it's more, I would say it's more of an art book project in relation to the fact that the music itself is an experimental documentation of content, and then it's in that artistic book type of container. So for the project, I made tapes. One is documenting on A sides the work that I created in my current apartment since moving, and is for myself such a personal catalog of my experiences since moving back, and just like with space and socially and whatever. And the previous work on the B-sides, Old Rooms, is moving through all of the different places I've lived and all of the places I've traveled to. I believe space is active in facilitating the experience that you're having, and there's so much non-visual information stored inside of that space. So with Old Rooms, I recorded in my childhood bedrooms, my brother's bedroom, my old apartments, Airbnb types of situations while I was traveling, at residencies. These spaces are collaborating with what gets recorded. They're active. So the documentation project kind of creates contrasts between the spaces, and especially because on the A sides of the tape it's a constant, and with the B sides of the tape it's always in transition, always in movement. So the differences between the spaces, I think, are more clear, and the songs are more abstract. They're less grounded because that's the kind of states I was in inside of those transitionary spaces. I also believe that with music, you're translating and kind of like converging so many pieces of that information. So not only just like sonically in the shape of the room or the shape of the instrument, or like vibrationally where I'm at and what I'm producing, but it's also just like memories that were in the space of everything that's ever happened in the space, everything that's active kind of energetically, I suppose, and then all of the memories and the space that I'm in the moment of making the music. So it's a very strange project, I guess abstract, I mean, not strange. And the animation, I think, always as a medium caters to lo-fi music and experimental music. It really it gives it something that it needs. So I was really excited to get the chance to work on Little Window and focus on bringing these two things together, but then also that reflection back from the animation standpoint, how I took looping animations, and then the music is also created by looping more simple music structures than I'm used to working with, just because it's improvised and instantaneous, and then lining those loops up and seeing how they reflect back on each other. So from the animation standpoint, just seeing how that recontextualizes the sound or your assumptions about narrative inside of the music, it was a really interesting learning process, and I'm excited to keep going with Little Window as an ongoing project and create some more animation work. To finish everything up, I'll screen a few of the animations with clips of the music. So here we go. I know you.